Okay, this is test 2 material, and we'll be going over skeletal system. Okay, some functions of the skeletal system is it does support us. Our bones are weight-bearing, and it does offer protection. Our skull protects our brain, our ribs protect our vital organs. Allows for movement, so muscles are attached to bone, and with the two systems, skeletal system and the muscle system, it does allow for movement. Bone is a great place for storage. Different minerals are stored in bone, calcium, phosphorus, and there's some fat in bone, so it's a good area for storage. For reserve energy and insulation that fat offers. And it also gives rise to our red blood cells. So RBC there is red blood cells. The red marrow is what makes the red blood cells, and that's inside of our bone. It's in the medullary cavity, which we'll look at that in a little bit, of bone. Okay, bone, cartilage, tendons, ligaments. So these are some of the major things we're going to look at between the skeletal system and the muscle system. Muscle does taper into a tendon and attaches to bone. Cartilage is in between two bones coming together to help protect the bone, reduce friction, things like that. And then the ligaments are what actually holds the two bones together. I like to look at the ligament similar to your old school an arrow. You know, we've got an arrowhead, and the arrowhead is put on the wooden shaft and tied down with a leather string. That leather would represent the way our ligaments behave. It holds our bones together. These are considered connective tissue. Okay, the extracellular matrix is responsible for their characteristics. The matrix contains this collagen, which means glue-producing, tough rope-like protein. Now, do know that the matrix that we have for our connective tissue and bone and all that, extremely important. Now we'll talk about some of those importancies later. Proteoglycans, know this term, the proteoglycans. It is a protein plus a polysaccharide, which is a sugar. These are found in discs and our different connective tissue, and when you look at them under a microscope, they kind of look like needles of a pine tree. And then these needles, so that area, attract and retain water between the needles. So please know this, that proteoglycans are designed to attract and retain water. It's a very important concept and a function of our bodies and necessary for connective tissue health. So the matrix contains the collagen, the proteoglycans, water, and minerals. Okay, we have 4 types of bone. We have long bone, because it's longer than it is wide. Femur, which is your thigh bone, would be a good example. The humerus, which is your arm bone, is another example. So these are long bones. A short bone is approximately as wide as it is long. So wrist bones and ankle bones are good examples of short bones. Flat bones, thin, flat shape. Skull bones, your ribs, scapula, sternum would be examples of flat bone. And then an irregular bone would be your vertebra and your facial bones. So do know your 4 types of bone and be able to give examples of each on the test. Okay, these are the different parts of a bone. So the diaphysis, epiphysis, articular cartilage, epiphyseal plate, also known as a growth plate, and epiphyseal line are all found on bone. I'm going to jump to the next slide and then come back to this one. So this diagram here, okay, we're going to look at this. So keep that in mind. And then we're going to go back to this slide. Okay, so the diaphysis is the long central shaft part of the bone. The epiphysis is the ends of the long bone. So notice this is plural, the ends of the long bone, both the proximal and distal end. Articular cartilage covers the end of the epiphysis. So this is where the bone connects to another bone. So this is your joint or articulation. Articulation is just a fancy word for a joint. The epiphyseal plate, also known as the growth plate, this is what allows for bone growth and skeletal maturity. So we'll see a picture of this on the next slide. It is made of cartilage at first and then fills in over time with calcium. So that's how bone hardens. So the matrix is this, we'll just say, gel-like substance, and if you keep depositing minerals within it, it will harden. So that's your ossification. So ossification is the way that bones gradually harden over time. And so consider, a newborn. Their bones are not ossified yet, meaning it's not a mature adult skeleton. It's still relatively cartilaginous. As that matrix gets deposited with calcium and other minerals over time, it hardens. Okay, so not only does a newborn's bone harden over time, but it also grows. The epiphyseal line is the remnants of that epiphyseal plate that fills in with the calcium and minerals over time. Okay, this slide will be more descriptive because now we have a picture to go with all of it. Okay, this is a femur. This is the femoral head. Okay, you're seeing the greater trochanter here. So this is the proximal end. This part would go into your hip. That's the acetabulum. Now, obviously they've cut it here, so you're not really seeing the full length of the bone. But notice this says young bone, so this is youth. Probably, we'll just say a 6-year-old bone right here. You can see the epiphyseal plate. Okay, there's another epiphyseal plate. This is the growth plate. So this will eventually ossify over time, which will look like this. So there's the remnant of that growth plate, now called the epiphyseal line. So this is a mature adult bone, likely the age of, we'll just say 22 or older. Okay, so here's the epiphysis. There and there, ends of long bone. There's the diaphysis, that long central shaft. Okay, articular cartilage here, which goes on the end of the bone. So you see an articular cartilage there and down here. Just want to make sure we're not missing anything. Okay. The medullary cavity, so let's go back to the other slide. Medullary cavity is this area here. This is medullary cavity. Contains the red marrow, and that is what produces your red blood cells. You also find the yellow marrow in there. That is mostly fat. The red marrow is the blood-forming producing marrow. In youth, you will have more red marrow, and then as you get into your adult body, that red marrow declines in volume over time. Typically, the red marrow is confined to the proximal ends of long bone. That's where you find a higher concentration of the red marrow, the proximal ends of long bone. Okay, the periosteum, the endosteum and osteoblast. So let's go back to that slide. So the periosteum is the outer layer of bone, okay? So if you look at this picture over here, this is showing you a full femur. Everything you see on the outside there, that's the periosteum. Okay, so over here we're seeing a close-up of it. So this is the outside of bone, and this is a very sensitive layer. So there's some notes that you're going to have to take on the side here that I want you to know about periosteum. So it is the outer surface of bone, the outer layer, the outer part of bone. It is a dense connective tissue. It does contain blood vessels and nerves, which means it is going to be sensitive to pain. Okay, blood vessels means it's highly vascularized. The periosteum is also where the tendon attaches itself to. Okay, so if this is your bone, right here, here's your muscle, there's the tendon, okay, muscle, tendon, bone. Alright, we're going to zoom in to this area here. Okay. So there's the tendon. There's the bone. So we've zoomed in. This site is called the enthesis. The enthesis is where tendon embeds itself into the periosteum of bone. That's called the enthesis. When there's excessive pulling, now when you run, walk, any muscle contraction, you are pulling on bone. That's a good thing. And we'll talk about why that's a good thing later, but that's a good thing. Resistance against gravity. However, if that is excessive, you're going to start to create micro tears in the periosteum of bone. Okay, this is where you get your so-called shin splints from. So these shin splints, quote unquote, can happen anywhere in the body, anywhere there's excessive pulling of the tendon on the periosteum of bone. Now, because the periosteum is highly vascularized and there's a lot of nerves, this hurts. Okay, this is why shin splints hurt. Now, the solution is rest. Okay, and then of course your RICE protocol, rest, ice, compression, elevation. And that is going to be the best, one of the best things to do for shin splints or anything in your body that mimics that. So the technical term is called enthesiopathy. Okay, enthesiopathy is where the enthesis gets inflamed because of the excessive pulling of the tendon on the periosteum. You get the micro tears, the micro fractures, and it hurts. Okay, now most people will push through this, so it's going to get worse and more inflamed over time, which is going to lead to more problems. Also know that the tendon is literally stitched into the periosteum by this tendon-like thread called Sharpie's fibers. Okay, Sharpie's fibers are the tendon-like threads that basically stitch the tendon into the periosteum of bone. and that is a very strong connection. In fact, so strong that you can have an avulsion fracture. An avulsion fracture is where the tendon pulls so hard on bone, it pulls bone off of itself. Okay, that's called an avulsion fracture. Now later we're going to get into some fractures, so I'm not going to really get too deep into the avulsion fractures right now, but we will later in another lecture as we start looking at different types of fractures. Okay, the endosteum. Okay, so notice the word peri. Okay, outer, around, endo, which is the inside endosteum. This lines the medullary cavity. So let's go back to our picture. So you can see the endosteum in here. So there's endosteum, and it lines the medullary cavity. So that's the inside part. Okay, osteoblasts. So osteo is bone. Blast, this is a weird word. In this case, it actually means build. Because when we think of the word blast, we typically think destruction, like you bring down a building or whatever, blast. But in this case, it actually means build. Okay, so the periosteum and endosteum contain osteoblasts, a bone building product. Its job is to repair and remodel bone. Now keep in mind, bones are dynamic. They are always being replaced and being challenged, and that's a good, healthy thing. You want your bones to grow healthy. You want to grow and age into a healthy skeleton, which we'll talk about that in another lecture as well. That's going to be a functional medicine thing with mineralization of bone and osteoporosis, osteopenia, what's going on with our society, and brittle bones and softening of bones and so forth. So we'll get into that later on. But for right now, know that osteoblasts build bone. Bone needs to be dynamic, so you've got to move. Movement is very important for the health of our bones. Okay, the two types of bone that we have is compact bone and cancellous bone. Compact is solid, very solid, and cancellous bone is lacy. Cancellous bone is also known as spongy bone. So we'll see a picture of it here. Here's compact bone. You're seeing they're taking a little section there. We're going to magnify it, and it's just solid. It's compact. It's got blood vessels that enter and exit. Also, waste and nutrients and so forth are taken in and out of these so-called tunnel systems called the Haversian canal system. Okay, so these are basically the tunnels that allow for these blood vessels to run through the Haversian system. Okay, spongy bone, also known as cancellous bone, is lacy, as you can see here. All these lace-looking things are called trabeculae, and what they do is it gives the bone strength without all the weight. And also, typically the trabecula, the spaces that you see in there are filled with marrow. Typically there's bone marrow in all that. So next time you're in lab and you get a chance to look at bone, especially the real human bones, you will see the trabecula, because some of them are chipped and broken to some degree. So you'll be able to see the trabecula in some of the real human cadaver bones that we have in lab. Okay, just another diagram that shows you the epiphysis on either end. There's the diaphysis, the long central shaft. Spongy bone, compact bone, where the periosteum is, medullary cavity. Here's yellow marrow. Another good view of the periosteum with the highly vascularized with blood vessels and so forth. Articular cartilage. Epiphyseal line. Okay, ossification is the formation of bone by osteoblasts. So these are what build bone. So bone develops. The bone development in a baby is a process over time. So here you're seeing basically an X-ray of a baby in utero. You'll notice here. See how it looks like the bones in the hand are not connected to the bones of the forearm here? Well, they are. That is just connected with cartilage. Cartilage is not very dense, so X-ray beams go right through it. Keep in mind, X-rays pick up on dense objects. So the more dense the object, the brighter it looks on X-ray. And we'll get into some of the X-rays and bone stuff later in another section. So the two ossification or the two developmental processes is intramembranous ossification and then endochondral ossification. Both of these results in compact and cancellous bone formation. And this is where calcium and other minerals are gradually deposited over time. Okay, here's an X-ray. Over here you're seeing, this is the knee. So this would be the tibia. This is the fibula. This is the distal end of the femur. And it's showing you the different parts. So this is the diaphysis. And then the ends would be the epiphysis. You're also seeing the growth plate. Now that black line there is letting you know it is not very dense, so X-rays are going right through it, picking up on that space there because it's relatively cartilaginous. So there's your growth plate. This one you're also seeing the growth plate. So this is the ball and socket joint in the femur, femoral head in the acetabulum. So growth plate there, growth plate there. So this is a young bone. Okay, the vascular supply to the femoral head. I want to go over this because this is going to be a board question for a lot of you down the road, especially when you get to the pediatric section. It's leg-calf perthes. This is a disorder of avascular necrosis. In youth, they call that leg-calf perthes. In adult, it's avascular necrosis. Okay. So avascular means without blood supply. Avascular, without blood supply. Necrosis means dead or dying. So if your tissue is dead or dying, that's necrotic tissue. So when bone stops getting a blood supply, of course it's going to die. Any tissue is going to die without a blood supply. So this one is showing you the femur head, and then look at this extremely white section here. Okay, that's a high signal, and you shouldn't really see that. So this, from a radiograph perspective, this is letting you know that there's a disorder known as the snowcap sign. And it typically means that, if you look over on this side, the blood vessels that come into the femoral head have been compromised. And when blood is compromised, you're going to get tissue death. Okay, so typically what happens is the femoral neck can break, causing this, or just some sort of obstruction of blood supply coming in. In fact, if you guys remember Bo Jackson, he was a famous football baseball player, and he played for the Oakland Raiders in football and the Kansas City Royals in baseball. And he was tackled. The defense grabbed him by the leg, and just, the nature of how fast they were running, the size of the guys, that kind of thing. There was so much force in his femoral head and acetabulum. Long story short here, it cut off the blood supply and he developed avascular necrosis. A lot of bleeding took place. It was a pretty bad injury. Problem is they missed it. They just, for the most part, thought it was a sprained strain, and he was limping around and whatever, like, you'll get over it in a couple days. But it got worse. It got really bad. And then, they found out he had a type of avascular necrosis and tissue damage, so they had to do a hip replacement. Now that ended his football career, but he was able to come back to a professional baseball level. At that point, the Chicago White Sox picked him up. And kind of a cool story about that, his first at-bat with an artificial hip at the major league level, his first at-bat, hits a home run. Just a great athlete, great storyline, but that's what happened to him. Was there was so much damage in his hip, they needed to remove this, give him an artificial hip, but through rehab and a lot of hard work, he was able to get back to a pro level. Okay, this is your shoulder. So this is the scapula, the glenoid cavity, and then here's the humeral head. So this is your arm bone, your humerus. Same thing. So blood supply to this humeral head has been cut off. You can see that it's deformed. It's a type of avascular necrosis. So the collapse of the humeral head. So it's showing a deformity here. And there's a lot of sclerotic tissue. So all that white stuff you're seeing is very sclerotic tissue. Over here, they're showing you the arteries that come in, the circumflex arteries that come in, and if there's any kind of damage to the shoulder, you can cut off blood supply, and it can lead to avascular necrosis. The most common predisposing factors, fractures, look at this one, corticosteroids, okay, your steroid shots, cortisone. And, people get a lot of those. They get them in the knees, they get them in the hips, in the back, in the shoulder. We'll talk about cortisone shots later and what's going on with that, why they give them, but also how it can actually hurt you in the long run. But this is showing you shoulder, humeral head, and avascular necrosis. Okay, here's the leg calf perthes disease found in kids, and on this picture we'll just call it, there's A and then B, C, and D. So in A, you're seeing deformity in the tissue. Okay, here's your growth plates. This is a young bone, and typically these kids, they limp, they have hip pain. Oftentimes it's just overlooked, it's growing pains, it's whatever, and but then it gets worse over time, and so they start to get obliteration. So this tip here, if you look closely, is now gone. Okay, the tissue's being gone. It's necrotic. It's dying. And so this is now creating an abnormal femoral angle. You can see there's the angle in C there. The angle's different, and now we also have a permanent angle, because if this is left unchecked, yes, it'll get worse over time, but then the body will just heal it, but heals it incorrectly. And leg length inequality, there's cyst formation and bone, likely a permanent limp, pretty dysfunctional. Okay, so this is what can happen if it's missed. The condition is leg calf perthes disease, and you will see that on pediatric section and boards. Okay, here's a surgery for it. So they'll just add some hardware to make sure that the femoral angle stays as sound as possible. And then I'll let the body just remodel and heal over time.